Thanks to Card Market for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Marsh from StrataGames, and today we're talking about the Paupergeddon 2026 Spring Edition that just happened this past weekend. If you're unfamiliar with Paupergeddon, it is the largest Pauper tournament in the world. It happens 3 times a year in Italy, and they've been bringing in almost 1,000 players for the last several events, including this one. It is basically the Pauper Pro Tour. This event was 14 rounds of Swiss, and then you cut to a single elimination top 8. That meant day 1 on Saturday, you had to get at least 6-2 to be able to advance to day 2, which is a tough but fair cutoff in order to quell the numbers of players quite a bit. Then once you made it to day 2, you had 6 more rounds and just had to end up in the top 8 to be able to advance further. There were 983 players that signed up for the event, although when we get to the deck lists later, we actually only have 965 of those. I assume that means there were about 18 players who just didn't show up to the event. But still an absolutely fantastic turnout. This Paupergeddon had a stacked casting crew with Sapo, Skura, also known as Islands in Front, Andrea Mengucci, Emma Partlow, and Adepto Terra, or Alessandro Moretti. Every single one of these people are fantastic Pauper players. They know the game and format inside and out, and they provided just exemplary commentary in the booth. If you didn't get a chance to watch any of it, the VODs are still up on their Twitch channel. There will be a link in the description, but you should definitely watch some of it because we were able to watch some of the best Pauper play that you can, commentated by some of the best Pauper players. This was a full-scale event with artists and other special guests, including the professor from Tulare Community College, as well as various side events and things like that that you would see at any large tournament. What everyone was playing for were these fantastic prizes. First place was going to get 7,000 euro, and even if you just got in the top 64, you still walked away with 100 euro. These prizes were store credit, but with as much as 7,000, you could definitely walk away with several dual lands or other reserve list cards that you could easily turn into cash if you wanted to. Now let's get to the meta breakdown for day 1. To just about no one's surprise, Mono Red Madness was the most prevalent deck with over 12%. That's 115 players of the 965. This was also the most prevalent deck at the last Paupergeddon and the one that actually won it, so it's no surprise that people are going to try to capitalize on that success. But of course, people are going to be very prepared for it. Grixis Affinity, after being a lot lower for the last couple of years at tier 2, usually seen as a worst Jund Wildfire, has actually sprung back up with the help of a couple new cards like Ultra Monitor and Surveillance Cam, taking second place as the most prevalent deck here with over 10%. And then from there, every single deck has less than 10%. This is such a great breakdown for a format. One of the widest spreads that I've seen for any tournament across any format, which is always fantastic to see. Mono Blue Terror has actually fallen quite a bit since its last appearance at Paupergeddon, where it was the second most prevalent deck, down to 4th under Elves, which has been rising and rising. The only thing that usually keeps Elves down is Mono Red Madness, so it is a bit surprising to see this many Elves players, but it's a very tough deck for almost any other deck to compete with. Jund Wildfire still not out at 5.7% in the top 5 most prevalent decks, but definitely lower than we've seen previously. Spy Combo, a bit interestingly, still at 5% since the debut of its newest form, which is the 4 to 6 land Walls Spy combo deck. Last year, the deck has gained a ton of popularity for sure, but it's slowly been dwindling down, so seeing it still in the top 6 decks here is a little bit surprising because it's also a deck that's relatively easy to play around if you just stock enough removal or graveyard hate, but it can be a very potent choice into decks that don't have that kind of interaction. And Italian players must absolutely love Coggates because consistently I see it as one of the most prevalent decks at Paupergeddon. When online and at locals, it's generally not as favored. Then again, Coggates has also done absolutely fantastically in previous Paupergeddons. Last year at the Summer Paupergeddon, it took first place out of only 5 players who had brought it to the entire tournament, so it obviously can do extremely well in the hands of the right pilot. We have the same number of Gruul Monsters players, which has also fallen off since the last Paupergeddon. It was 4th highest meta share at the last Paupergeddon, which surprised almost everybody, and now it's a little bit more reasonably down here at 8th. Personally, I thought White Weenie was going to jump up even more than it did here. It has jumped from about 2% to 3.3%. I expected it almost to jump a little bit higher because of the newest Leonardo addition to the deck, which has made it very strong, quite a bit faster, and generally better against some of its weaker matchups. But it is still a deck that folds to spell-based combo decks and a lot of the harder control decks. Some other notable things about this chart: Gardens fell quite a bit. It was, I believe, the 5th highest at the last Paupergeddon, now down to 2.6% of the meta share. And oppositely, Dimir Terror has actually shot up quite a bit from being on the outskirts of 1% at the last one to up to 2.5%. The great thing about a tournament this size is even these decks on the right side that have as low as 1%, I'll show the Gruul Storm percent real quick, even just 1% of meta share for one of these decks means that 10 people decided to bring this deck to the tournament. Obviously a small sample size compared to the 100 players who brought Mono Red Madness, but it is still a little different from saying one person brought a random fringe deck to play. My beloved Mono Black Sacrifice was at 1.14%. 11 people brought it there. An Esper Affinity at 1.76, course, I love to see these. Jund Gardens has been gaining some popularity recently as a deck. Generally kind of a Golgari Gardens splashing red for Writhing Chrysalis, and recently playing Skred as well with Snowlands to make up for some even more removal. And Gruul Storm, or better known as Ruby Storm, was another surprising one to see 10 players with at the tournament. Overall though, like I said, this is a great distribution of decks for an 1,000-person tournament. Toskicologist on Reddit made this absolutely fantastic chart that shows the most prevalent cards in the format that were played out of the 1,000 decks, and how many copies over the course of all of them were there. This might not surprise a lot of us, but the most played card in the tournament was Pyroblast, with over 1,000 copies showing up in various decks. 80 fewer copies of Hydroblast, which is interesting. And of course, don't forget that we have Red Elemental and Blue Elemental Blasts down here, 733 and 732, respectively, copies, meaning almost 1,700 cards were Pyroblasts or Hydroblasts, 3,400 total. Definitely a bit of a prevalent card. Lorien Revealed is the third most played card, which makes sense as just about any blue deck you're going to want to have a bunch of copies. The majority of the cards on this list we can see are sideboard staples or even main deck staples like the Lorien Revealed. We have Nile Spellbomb, Lightning Bolt, Counterspell, Ichor Wellspring, Cast Down, Relic of Progenitus. The thing that I find most shocking about this list legitimately is that Refurbished Familiar is the fourth highest card. Obviously, Refurb is a fantastic card, but it's not a card that goes in every single deck of a certain color that can play it. You have to be playing Artifacts, which is not too difficult, but it still is a little surprising. Obviously, though, this does have multiple archetypes that are able to play the card. Grixis Affinity being the main one is going to be playing 4 copies, but also any Esper Affinity or Jav Blade or even a Mardu will be playing Refurbished Familiar. I've long said that this is the best creature in the format, and this might be a small indication that that is correct. I decided to do a quick breakdown by color of all of the cards here, just to see if we could find any interesting patterns. In the first column, there are only Grixis cards, which is not entirely surprising, as blue and red, and to a lesser extent black, have always been the most powerful colors in Pauper. We do get tons of green splotches here. Only 2 gold cards, which I find very interesting, which is Sneaky Snacker, not even really technically a gold card because you can play it in a mono red deck, and Writhing Chrysalis. And probably to nobody's surprise, white is the color with the fewest boxes, not even having one that shows up until the 4th column here. And because I just kind of like to collect data, even if I'm not exactly sure what to do with it, I also counted up the total instances of these cards per color here. So red was the most prevalent color in the format, with 9,627 cards showing up in the most prevalent cards. This is not a surprise because not only is Mono Red Madness the most prevalent deck, but also red shows up in many other prevalent decks like Grixis Affinity and Jund Wildfire. Potentially surprisingly is black is the 4th most prevalent color with only 4,786 cards here, and not surprising anyone, 1918 white cards being very low. 1,200 copies of gold cards across just 2, Sneaky Snacker and Writhing Chrysalis. We have artifacts and lands here. Every single land on this list is either a Grixis or Jund land. What do we do with this data? I don't know, but it is interesting. Maybe white needs a couple better cards for the format. Now looking at the day 1 to day 2 conversion rate, the total rate was 13.78%. 133 players out of the 965 made it to day 2 with at least a 6-2 record. Anything with a green number here means they increased their meta share somewhat on day 2, whereas the red numbers obviously resulted in a loss of meta share. Mono Red Madness stayed relatively consistent, going from 12% to 13.5%, keeping 18 players for day 2. Grixis Affinity staying almost exactly the same, 100 to 14 players. Jund Wildfire, which I wouldn't call an underdog, but was significantly less seen in the meta this time compared to other Paupergeddons, actually had the highest increase in conversion rate. 11 of its 55 players making it to day 2, going up to 8% of the meta now. Elves and Blue Terror actually lost a little bit. Terror fewer than 10% of its players, 61 to 6 players made it to day 2. And I want to talk about this Gardens number real quick. We had 26 day 1 players on Golgari Gardens, with 6 making it to day 2. Now, so many deck lists feature some sort of variation, whether you're playing Mono Blue Terror and you include Delver or Murmuring Mystic, Mono Red Madness and maybe you play Skittering Kitten or not. But at some point, enough cards or enough change in the deck's philosophy creates a new deck. Like Gruul Monsters and Gruul Panza share probably 80% of the same cards, but those 8 land destruction spells makes the deck feel quite a bit different. This is why I think it's important to break Food Pestilence away from just Golgari Gardens, Gardens being a little bit more of the traditional deck with a lot more removal, and some people call it the Emblems version because it usually plays Thorn of the Black Rose and Avenging Hunter as its main win cons, whereas Food Pestilence plays quite a few different cards: Pestilence, Cauldron Familiar, and then with Cauldron Familiar comes about a 10 food package, although Lembas is seen in both versions. The reason I wanted to call this out though is when we break this down, we actually had 20 traditional Gardens players in day 1 and 6 Food Pestilence players. And when you go to day 2, only 3 of the 20 Gardens players made it. However, also 3 of the Food Pestilence players made it. That means 50% of Food Pestilence players made it to day 2, whereas only 15% of the traditional Gardens players made it to day 2. Does this mean Food Pestilence is the better deck? Who knows? It could have been luckier matchups, it could have been more skilled players, it could have been a number of things, but I do think it's interesting to talk about. Jumping back into this official data from the Paupergeddon team, some of the interesting includes here on the right side, the only one of Black Turbofog player made it to day 2, so that's 100% conversion. One of the 3 Walls players made it to day 2, and one of the 2 Boros Bully players made it to day 2, all of which are just fantastic showings. I suppose while talking about that, I should jump back over to the green conversions on this left side. 5 of the 14 Rakdos Madness players made it. 4 out of 10 Ruby Storm players made it for a 40% conversion, the highest conversion rate that had over 2 players in its sample size. And then 3 of the 10 Gruul Panza players made it as well. Unfortunately for me, Mono Black Sacrifice and Esper Affinity only had 1 player make it to day 2. Definitely a bit of a drop off. Also some decks that did not make it to day 2. We had 7 blue Turbofog players, 9 Dredge, 9 Mono Red Burn. I assume this is probably a Pinger Burn of some sort. And 5 Izzet Control. None of these decks made it to day 2 with even a single player. In case it helps visualize anything for anybody, here are the pie charts for day 1 and day 2. We can see Mono Red Madness and Grixis Affinity stayed at the top here, but Jund Wildfire actually jumped to 3rd most prevalent deck after day 1. Elves dropped just a single place. Spy Combo also came up. Mono Blue Terror was one of the biggest losers here, dropping from 4th to 8th most prevalent deck. Actually, I suppose it was tied for, 6th, so maybe a little misleading here because all 3 of these Dimir Terror Gardens and Blue Terror were at 4.51%. Just remember, when we're looking at any official data from Paupergeddon like this, the Gardens is including the Pestilence, whereas I broke it out for my own personal data. But again, this is just a great snapshot of just how wide our format is. 7 decks in the top 50% of the metagame is already a pretty good number. And then what is this, 20 or 30 more decks for the last half? Not to mention the tiny sliver of other decks. I just kept finding more people making great content for Paupergeddon that I wanted to include it. So this is by Cross Entropy on Twitter, but they made a fantastic breakdown of win rates for the decks at the Paupergeddon. So if you look at any deck on the left side here, Grixis Affinity, and then match it up with a deck up here, you can see how well they did against each other. Grixis Affinity actually has a really bad matchup against Mono Green Elves. I know for a long time people thought that that was a good matchup because Kart Clan Shaman just dominates Elves. However, that's only 2 or 3 copies of a card that you need to win the game, and if you don't have that, Elves is actually quite resilient to just a Galvanic Blast or 2. Not to mention, Elves runs Masked Vandal's main deck, which can just make for a non-game pretty quickly if they're able to exile your land and you don't recover. I think the best takeaway from this chart here is actually jumping all the way down to Dimir Terror, which has the highest win rate overall of any deck at the tournament. 56.5% with 186 matches is a fantastic win rate. And if you look at the individuals, you can see that it has mostly favored matchups. This is a small sample size to compare this to the format at large, but it's still a very good bit of information to look at. Here, Dimir Terror had a 71% win rate against Mono Red Madness, whereas Mono Blue Terror had a 56% win rate. Still very good, but nowhere near as incredible. Dimir Terror had 52% against Grixis Affinity, 68% against Elves, 90% against Terror, 90% against Mono Blue Terror. Those extra black removal spells really working in your favor. 53% against Jund, 62% against Gruul Monsters, 63% against Golgari Spy. And the only matchups that it really lost out on are ones that are not as prevalent as a lot of the other decks. Coggates, Mono Red Rally, not that those are fringe decks, but still not the highest meta shares ever. Mono Blue Fairies, Ultratron, and Dimir Fairies had bad matchups against as well, but also great win rates against Golgari Gardens, White Weenie, and Azorius Familiars. We'll continue to see Dimir Terror being absolutely fantastic as we look at some more data in a bit, but this is just a great snapshot of how well the deck did. The biggest loser, according to this chart, was unfortunately Azorius Coggates with only a 42.9%. But after that is actually Mono Blue Terror, 45%, only having favorable matchups against a few of these: Mono Red Madness, Coggates, Rally, Gardens, and Familiars. So it definitely seems like, based on this chart, the Black Splash is worth it. Jumping into the top 64 here, looking at conversions and whatnot. Mono Red Madness, still the most prevalent deck in the top 64, with 8 players, making up 12.5%. Grixis Affinity maintains second, and Elves reclaims third, with Jund Wildfire jumping back down to only 4 decks in the format. Dimir Terror, like I said, being extremely impressive. 6 players made it to day 2, 6 Dimir Terror players made it to top 64. Not a single one of them being eliminated up to this point. Similarly, Ruby Storm, who only had 10 players going into the tournament, 4 of which made day 2, all 4 of which made top 64. Ruby Storm arguably being the quote-unquote winner of the tournament, not necessarily the actual first place winner, as we'll get to that, but it's a deck that has been in relative obscurity for a long time, being brewed by the likes of Kalikai's, another Pauper YouTuber, for well over a year, I believe, but a deck that has not necessarily been the most impressive or shown up and put up results, but clearly doing some work here, with 4 pilots making it all the way to top 64. We'll definitely take a look at some of those deck lists in just a bit. Mono Blue Terror did reclaim a bit of its pride, 4 of its 6 players making it to top 64, 4 of 7 Spy Combo players, 2 of the 3 Food Pass players made it to top 64, 2 players as well for Azorius Familiars, Coggates, White Weenie, Ultratron, and Rakdos Madness. And then the last players who made it to top 64, a 1 of Red Rally, Blue Fairies, Bogles, Mono Black Sacrifice, hell yeah, Gruul Ponza, Walls, Black Turbo Fog, and Pizza Combo. This data here was taken directly from the Paupergeddon website. It said that there were 2 players playing this deck originally. Again, we'll take a look at this deck list in a second. The data did say none of them made it to day 2, however, one of them made it to top 64. So unless one of them somehow squeezed their way in, I assume there's a bit of a mistake here. This means, unfortunately, we're going to be saying goodbye for top 64 to Gruul Monsters, Dimir Fairies, Traditional Gardens. Of course, we have 2 Pestilence lists in there. Jund Gardens, Monstertron, Orzhov Blade, Esper Affinity, Dimir Control, Cycle Storm, Mono White Heroic, Other Gates, Boros Bully, and also this one TBD. Not exactly sure what's going on with that either. And this is my favorite part of the video, which is where we get to look at the top 64 deck lists and see the interesting includes that players brought, cards that could surprise your opponent that they wouldn't be expecting, to counter the counters to your deck, and just various cards that we can all start playing and testing out on our own. Of course, several of these deck lists are actually relatively stock, as that's how you get to be in a really good spot in a big tournament like this. So the first one I want to call out is 58th place Ultratron by Cassini. It's a pretty standard Ultratron deck for the most part. The sideboard's also pretty standard. I've seen a lot of these Temporal Interventions going around, Pulse of Marasa, Pyroblast. The main thing I thought was interesting was Makeshift Munitions. I'm not much of an Ultratron player, so maybe this is more common than I think, but I've never seen it out of the list. It seems like an interesting outlet as opposed to using like a Golem Foundry or just gaining infinite life. I would assume this is probably a sideboard card against like Fog, because if you are against Fog, infinite life does not win you the game, since they're probably going to mill you out, and Golem Foundries don't win you the game either. So this would be the win con there. That's my assumption. A couple Coggates decks did make it to top 64, and this one in 56th by Randall looks relatively stock in the main deck at first. However, this deck is running a Black Splash that we've seen in a few decks online in the past. I actually tried out a similar list a little while ago, but a Thorn of the Black Rose in the main deck, 2 Suffocating Fumes, also a Ride's End, which is interesting when you're playing black to not be playing Cast Downs in the main deck and instead playing the Ride's End here. Contaminated Aquifer to be grabbed by Lorien Revealed to help splash that black. We also have a Campfire in the main deck, which is interesting. Generally, you can gain enough life off of your Sacred Cats. And then sideboard, we have Extract a Confession, Arms of Hadar, which is one of the best reasons to be playing black here, and another Thorn of the Black Rose. So taking that traditional Azorius Coggates and adding black, not just for the sideboard, but for the main deck, definitely an interesting take here. Jund Wildfire in 55th place. Mostly pretty standard, but I noticed a Golgari Rot Farm in the main deck. Very interesting include. Of course, bounce lands can be extremely strong, as they kind of take the place of 2 lands. Also playing a 1 of Terminate over the 4th Cast Down. There could be a number of reasons for this. There are not that many creatures that regenerate, so that's probably not the reason. Could be very well that Terminate is here to hedge against Guardian of the Guild Pact, knowing that Coggates has been a prevalent deck at most Paupergeddons, or this could be a hedge against the new Leonardo and various other legendary creatures that don't die to cast down anymore. Terminate could be an answer to them, and of course it fills the role of doing both, and in a deck with 3 colors and a lot of ways to fix your mana with Cleansing Wildfires and things like that, not too straining on the mana that it becomes difficult to cast. 54th place we have Black Sack, and this deck list, I must say, looks pretty impressive. I may be a little biased though, because this is 74 of my 75 card stock list, or at least the stock list I had about a month ago. The only difference is the sideboard Thorn of the Black Rose in place of a Mesmeric Fiend. This is a very interesting one. This deck is not running any Dark Rituals or anything like that, so Thorn is definitely just for, I assume, slower matchups, maybe Jund or something like that, where you might need the Monarch to get back a little bit of extra value. I haven't tried Thorn of the Black Rose in the sideboard myself, but maybe I'll have to after seeing this deck list. Between last Paupergeddon and this one, there has been the question of, if I'm playing Mono Blue Terror, should I play Delver of Secrets or should I play Murmuring Mystic? And Hardinger, who took 53rd, decided, why not have a little bit of everything? 3 Delvers of Secrets and 1 Murmuring Mystic in the main deck. And then similarly, a lot of people ask, for my 1 mana counterspells, do I want Dispel, Spell Pierce, or Force Spike? Why not all 3? 1 Dispel, 2 Force Spike, 1 Spell Pierce here for Hardinger. Your opponent's never going to be able to anticipate exactly what you might be holding with that counterspell suite. Grixis Affinity in 52nd here, playing 4 of the new Utrom Monitor and 2 Sewer Valence Cam. This is a card that started showing up in a lot of combo lists, but Affinity has picked it up a little bit as just a divination on a stick, a cheap artifact that can gain you a little bit of tempo advantage by tapping your opponent's creature so they can't attack, which can be really important on the Giant Terror or something like that. It can even tap twice because it enters, taps, and then when it leaves, it taps something as well. Or you can even use it to surprise your opponent's small creature attacking by untapping your own Utrom Monitor or Mere Enforcer and eating their 2/2. In addition, the sideboard here was running Thorn of the Black Rose, which I thought was a very interesting include. Definitely, I can see it making some sense, but not one that you usually see in Grixis Affinity lists. Jund Wildfire in 51st here. Nothing too surprising, although running quite a few 1-ofs. Blood Fountain down to 1 from the usual 2 that a lot of lists have been running. Only 1 Eviscerator's Insight. Nyxborn Hydra, which a lot of people have cut. A Pulsa Marasa, and a 1 of main deck Troublemaker Oof. Sideboard, we're also running an Avenging Hunter, which helps to blur the lines between this deck and Golgari Gardens even more. A lot of people already compare the two as they're both very grindy, value-oriented decks. 50th place, Elves here, playing only 8 lands, 7 forests and a gingerbread cabin with 4 land grants. And interestingly, only 3 Winding Ways, favoring a You Meet in a Tavern instead. Slightly more expensive for basically a Lead the Stampede effect, but in a pinch it can also buff your entire team, totally surprising your opponent, and attacking with a bunch of 3/3s. Sideboard also looks relatively standard, except a 2 of Fang Dragon in the sideboard, which can be cast off of your Birchlore Rangers. This seems like the perfect tech card for the Mirror, killing off all of your opponent's elves, with a creature that you can even grab off of Lead the Stampede and Winding Way. 49th place is the only Walls player that made it to top 64. Pretty standard Walls list, although Gingerbread Cabin is a card that we've started seeing a ton in Elves, but this is the first time I've seen it in Walls, although you still have your 4 Quirion Rangers and a whole bunch of Forests, so it makes sense you can play it here as well. Sideboard features some interesting cards, Spider Silk Armor, as a way to make it harder for your opponent to kill your creatures, and it gives you reach against any flyers that you're worried about. A couple Bramble Worms as life gain for the sideboard, choosing this over like a Weather the Storm, obviously because you can grab it off of Lead the Stampede, and you make so much mana that playing a 7-drop is not that big of a deal. 47th here we have, it says Mono Blue Terror, but the deck list is very much Dimir Terror, the first of 6 Dimir Terror decks, in fact, with of course Snacker, Terror, Gurmag Angler, but this one playing a couple Ghastly Demise, which is a fantastic looking card for this deck. 1 mana instant, destroy target non-black creature if its toughness is less than or equal to the number of cards in your graveyard. Obviously non-black is quite a restriction, but this looks to be taking the place of Snuff Out in this deck, paying only 1 mana instead of 0 for your removal spell, but you don't lose life, so this is definitely a way to hedge against all of the mono-red madness that was running around. It's not hard to have 2 or 3 cards in your graveyard to be able to destroy a Gutter Snipe or Kessig Flame Breather. And not losing 4 life is a huge boon for the deck. So this is a really heads-up card that I think could actually see some more play in this deck in the future. The sideboard also features a 1 of Murmuring Mystic for those slower control games, and also 2 Mystic Remora. Commander players rejoice, I guess? I was able to see one of these cast on coverage against a combo deck, which then proceeded to cast no non-creature spells for about 5 turns. It's a very interesting choice to try to win against control or combo decks. And for just 1 mana to play and a cumulative upkeep of just 1, really not too hard to keep around for several turns. We have 3 spy combo decks in a row here, but this one's pretty interesting by Kuhn Schuster. We play not 4, but 5 land spy, which is a little bit less typical, 4 forests and a swamp, with a sideboard of a red plan, 1 mountain, Mog Fanatic, and Fang Dragon to deal with various 1 toughness creatures. Elves, I assume, for the Fang Dragon. Mog Fanatic could be good for elves too, I suppose. Don't play a lot of spy, so I'm not exactly sure all of the intent here, but definitely some interesting sideboard cards. And jumping up to 44th here, a more traditional 4-land spy, but in the sideboard we, similar to the Mog Fanatic, have 4th Bridge Prowler, a 1/1 that when enters gives -1/-1 to an opposing creature. This you don't have to splash red for, and I assume another card that's good against elves. Could also be for fairies or Red Rally or something like that, but those are already matches where I assume you're in a bit of a better spot, whereas elves seems like it could be a tough one. 43rd elves here, nothing crazy, but Elvish Vanguard is a card that, as the deck has gotten a little bit more contemporary with things like Avenging Hunter, Generous Ent, Nyxborn Hydra, generally Elvish Vanguard has fallen a little bit out of favor, but we're still seeing a few copies here. Also the Gingerbread Cabin, not in the main deck, but in the sideboard here. Most players I've seen have tended to just put it in the main deck, opening up a sideboard slot. But if you really don't want the potential to have that tap land against an opponent where the life isn't super relevant, I can see putting this in the sideboard. 42nd place here is our first Ruby Storm, which takes after modern Ruby Storm, having a bunch of creatures that reduce the cost of your red spells, Thornscape Familiar, Goblin and Archomancer, and Spider Manifestation, which while it doesn't technically reduce the cost, does make up for it by just making mana on its own. You have a whole bunch of draw spells like Glimpse the Impossible and Pirate's Pillage, ways to make mana like Manamorphose and Seething Song, and then eventually you cast a First Day of Class to give haste to your Seize the Storm giant elemental tokens. Burning Curiosity is also a newish card from Lorwyn Eclipsed that is showing up in a couple of these deck lists. And then First Day of Class allows you to also learn a lesson from your sideboard. So here we have Abandoned Attachments, Firebending Lesson as some removal, Origin of Metal Bending, which can either destroy an artifact or enchantment, like a Relic of Progenitus, or can protect one of your creatures. Waterbending Lesson, which isn't too hard to splash with all the treasures running around, gives you even more card draw. And then How to Start a Riot, which is basically a Trumpet Blast, +2/+0 for 3 mana to your team, which if your opponent's able to deal with the Seize the Storm tokens, this is a way to just make all of your random mana dorks more lethal and actually be able to attack in for damage themselves. A Flaring Pain for any Fog or Prismatic Strands your opponent's playing. And a few of these lists feature bounce lands in the sideboard for more grindy matchups, allowing you to bounce your depletion lands before they run out. But this deck's running Izzet Boilerworks and Early Frost, which definitely seems like an interesting include. This seems a bit like the same type of tech that High Tide was playing with Giga Drowse, being able to tap all of your opponent's lands on the turn before you go off, making it so they can't have up counter spells or removal or anything like that. An interesting deck and a lot of interesting includes in the sideboard here from Beatrice. One of our 2 Rakdos Madness decks that made it looks pretty standard, but had a 1 of Stormstreak Feral in the deck, which I thought was an interesting include. And here we have an Azorius Familiars, also relatively normal, but I thought Stonehorn Dignitary in the sideboard was interesting tech. Of course, this deck already likes to play very controlling, and flickering is something they already do, but Stonehorn Dignitary is usually a card I see in Flickertron decks, not in Familiars, but maybe this is just tech that I'm not super familiar with. Familiar with. 38th place, we had a 1 of Bogles, playing Conduit Pylons as a way to help you find the key cards for your deck. It's definitely an interesting choice because if you don't have the right colors of mana, paying an extra 1 for them is really difficult. But this is a deck that needs to find its key pieces very quickly, and Conduit Pylons helps with that. It's also playing a couple Spider Umbra as both reach and extra protection for your creatures. Another mono blue terror here playing Artful Dodge, another card that is no stranger to this deck, but definitely hasn't seen a ton of play in the last several months, especially since it used to be, I think, a staple in the deck, but then Sleep of the Dead kind of took over that place as the flashback card that allowed your creatures to get in for damage. Also interestingly, playing only 2 Ponder and a 1 of Consider. A lot of times I see Consider in blue terror decks, it's a budget choice, Consider being considerably less expensive than Mental Note, but here it seems to just be a choice that they wanted to play. Maybe having 1 extra instant can be really helpful, but obviously doesn't look as many cards as Ponder is very interesting. The second Rakdos Madness list similarly is relatively stock, but has a 1 of Sazakep's Brew, so it seems these decks have maybe 1 flex slot for an extra draw 2 effect, and this is the one that they have chosen to go with. The next Dimir Terror on our list here features a 1 of Dahada's Ploy, a card that generally I only see in Dimir Spirits, and 2 Disrupt. I know this is some tech that Against or Alexander Weber used a while ago in Dimir Terror. I tried it out and really enjoyed it, and it's making another appearance here, which is always sweet. Also, something that I found absolutely shocking is playing only 2 cast downs and a third removal spell in Go for the Throat. Go for the Throat is generally just seen as your 5th copy of Cast Down, because it doesn't hit any of the affinity creatures that are going to be running around. Cast Down's only downside is it can't hit legendary creatures, so I can only assume this has to have been a consideration, assuming there was going to be a good amount of White Weenie running around with the new legendary Leonardo, and that might have been a legitimate concern for Salerno here. It's either that or they were worried about seeing Orokusaki, but that seems a little bit less likely. In 32nd, we have Venditti on Elves. Pretty standard main deck, but their sideboard featured this card Lignify, which turns a creature into a 0/4 treefolk with no abilities. This is not the only Elves player in the top 64 to play Lignify, and I realized afterwards, when Walker735 posted on his Twitter that Lignify was some tech that he and his team decided to implement for the Mono-Red Madness matchup. You don't really care about No-4, and turning your opponent's Gutter Snipe or Kessig Flamebreather into a useless creature is a really good way to not die to that creature. Definitely some sweet tech that seems to have worked out for them. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to Walker's list, who also made top 64 here. We have a mono blue fairies here, mostly standard stuff, although playing 1 of Dispel 2 for Spike, but with a 1 of Blossom Bind in the sideboard. This is a card that people were a little excited about when it came out, and generally hasn't been seeing that much play, but having 1 of here in the sideboard, definitely an interesting choice, especially over a Bind the Monster, which is cheaper than the bind. Here we get another spy combo, and this player seems to like 1-ofs more than I do, with a 1-of Beast Rider Vanguard, Elven Farsight, which seems like the type of card that 1-of is not going to make that big of a difference, a 1 Tinderwall, Quirion Ranger, Dimir Houseguard, and Troll of Khazad-dûm. The 1-ofs continue in the sideboard with a V2 Ghazi Inspector, card we see a lot in Elves, but not so much spy combo, and a 1-of Mountain, which is there to cast your Flaring Pain, or Gorilla Shaman, which is a card that generally has fallen out of favor as well, but in a deck like Spy Combo or even Elves, where you can make a lot of mana, could still be very strong against Affinity. We're also continuing to see the theme of a Spy Combo deck that needs to kill off 1/1s with Fume Spitter, although this deck also seems to care about killing other big creatures with cast downs in its sideboard, something we haven't seen in any of the other Spy Combo lists. Monstertron has gained a ton of popularity recently, with a lot of new cards in various sets, making the deck better. Unfortunately, we didn't have one make top 64, but we have a little bit of a sideboard game plan that looks like Monstertron in this Ultratron deck. Main deck, pretty straightforward. Try to go for the Golem Foundry or Infinite Life Win, but a sideboard of 4 Brambleworms. This is a deck that already features 3 Fangren Marauder to gain a bunch of life, so I can only assume the Brambleworm is also just meant to be a lethal attacker with Trample, though obviously still another good card to play, or maybe just additional copies of cards that gain you life for the Madness Burn matchup. We have another Grixis Affinity here, the only one playing Gearseeker Serpent in the top 64. Also playing 2 Cryogen Relics, so definitely going a little heavier on the blue, and a 1 of Cast Down and Eviscerator's Insight. Definitely some interesting numbers here. 24th place, we have one of our White Weenie decks that made it to top 64, and not just that, top 32. Nothing too shocking from this deck list. It is running 2 Spider-Man Web Slingers, as well as 3 Leonardo Big Brother, making it so it is pretty resilient to cast down, choosing not to play any Militia Bugler in its 3-drop slot to grab the Leonardos in favor of those Spider-Mans. We have another one of our Ruby Storm deck lists here, though admittedly this deck list doesn't have as many interesting includes. Looks a little bit more standard, with some Gruul Turfs in the sideboard, as opposed to those Is It Boilerworks we saw in the last one. Most Grixis Affinity players have decided that Ichor Wellspring is still worth playing over Cryogen Relic because having blue reliably on turn 2 is a little bit more difficult, but here we see a list that just embraces 4 Cryogen Relics fully, as well as 4 Utrum Monitors and of course Thoughtcasts, totally foregoing Great Furnace in its mana base and playing all 12 Bridges, Seat, and Vault of Whispers as its lands. Our third Ruby Storm here, this one also playing Burning Curiosity, although only 3 copies, but very interestingly playing 2 Writhing Chrysalis in the sideboard. I'm not sure exactly if this is a backup game plan of, oh, I can go for a mid-range win against the right deck, or with only 2 copies, it almost seems like maybe it's a sideboard card that just happens to be the best card against some certain deck, maybe something like White Weenie, where having 3 bodies and a reach creature can be really effective. Although I think your matchup, Ruby Storm versus White Weenie, is already probably pretty favored, as long as you don't get Thraben Charmed, so I'm not sure that's what it's for, but Writhing Chrysalis continuing to show up in any deck that can play green and red. Top 20 now, we get our first Gardens list, Remember, this is Food Pestilence, as no traditional gardens actually made top 64. This deck list, actually only playing 2 Pestilence, where most decks are running 3, has some interesting one-ofs. A one-of Malevolent Rumble, Heritage Reclamation, Go for the Throat, and Tragic Slip, in addition to, of course, 4 cast downs. Also playing 2 Crypt Rats. Generally not seen as necessary, seeing as you're already playing Pestilence in the main deck, but only 2 copies, I guess, replacing one of those with the Crypt Rats. In 19th place here, with Elves, we have Don Francesco, also known as Walker735 online, running a very similar, if not exactly the same list as his teammate before, the other one with the Lignify in the sideboard. He posted on his Twitter account that he played against 4 Mono Red Madness players during the tournament, which is generally a very bad matchup for Elves, and won against all 4 of them, in large part due to the Lignify doing a lot of work. 18th place, we have a Mono Red Madness. I've skipped over most of the Mono Red Madness lists so far, simply because they've all been pretty stock. No interesting includes, but this one did feature some Suplex, one of only 2 decks that are running Suplex in the top 64, which is an interesting choice. In addition to Cast into the Fire, tons of artifact removal to go up against those affinity players, but also being able to deal 3 damage and not just 1 to 2 different creatures can make Suplex good against some decks where Cast in the Fire is not as strong. In 17th place, we have Jund Wildfire. This is the only Jund Wildfire pilot that played Gixian Infiltrator in the top 64 out of 4 pilots, as opposed to last Paupergeddon, where I believe there were 6 Jund Wildfire pilots in top 64 and 4 of them were playing Gixian Infiltrator. This could indicate that Infiltrator is just not as good to play anymore because of the shifting meta and deck lists and things like that, or it can also just show that some cards rise in popularity and then lose popularity as people just decide to shift back to the traditional list. We have another Dimir Terror list here, featuring Unmurmuring Mystic in the main deck, not just the sideboard, as another win con that your opponent may not be expecting, and also another list running 2 Mystic Remoras in the sideboard for those control and combo matchups. Our only Mono Red Rally in the top 64 made 15th place. They too are playing Suplex in the sideboard, and shockingly to me, only 2 Experimental Synthesizer. This isn't the first time I've seen only 2 synths in a Red Rally list, but to me synth seems like one of your best spells, so it shocks me that we're playing so few here. But I suppose the Reckless Impulse and Ren's Resolve cards have been favored a little bit more, because you don't lose the card at the end of turn, so you get a little bit more time to plan when you want to cast those. So you get a little more time to plan when you want to cast those spells. Yet another Dimir Terror list here in 14th. One of Murmuring Mystic in the main deck, as we just saw before, but also another Mystic in the side and a Thorn of the Black Rose. Not absolutely shocking, as Thorn shows up a lot in Dimir Fairies, a relatively similar list, but still not one you see every day. Finally, we arrive to 13th place, Sestari, who is playing the Pizza combo deck so many people were talking about. This is a teamer deck with a brand new combo, relying on a new card from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The combo uses 3 cards, Devoted Druid, which of course is a classic combo card, and then Banishing Knack or Retraction Helix, which do the same thing. Give a creature tap, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. And then the new card is Guac and Marshmallow Pizza, a green artifact that has flash. When it enters, target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn and untap it. So all you need to do is have Devoted Druid out without Summoning Sickness. You cast a Retraction Helix on it, so every single time it can tap for either a green mana or to bounce a non-land permanent. You tap it for a green, then you cast the Guac and Marshmallow Pizza to untap the Druid, giving it +2/+2. Then you can put a -1/-1 counter on this creature to untap it. So you do that to untap. You can retap it to bounce the Guac and Marshmallow Pizza to hand, and then you can put another -1/-1 counter on it to untap it, add a green mana to recast the pizza. The result of this is that you have an infinitely sized Devoted Druid, which can attack for lethal damage, and you can infinitely use Retraction Helix's ability to return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, so you can bounce all of your opponent's blockers before attacking for lethal. This deck has Abundant Growth to fix your mana and draw extra cards, Bountiful Landscape, a 1 of Brainstorm, which is a very interesting choice. Usually you'd want as many of this type of powerful cantrip as possible. 4 Cryogen Relics, some Dispels, Colony Garden, 2 Lorien Revealeds. We're playing Mystical Teachings as a way to find an instant or a card with flash, which means it can find the Pizza or the Retraction Helix, either half of the combo. Playing main deck Negates as well as Dispels. Perilous Research is essentially the blue Fanatical Offering or Deadly Dispute. A little bit worse because you don't get a treasure or map from it, but you also get to draw 2 first, then choose what you sacrifice. So if you draw 2 lands, for example, you could then sacrifice a land, knowing that you have plenty in hand. And it also just makes it so you don't have to be playing black, since this deck is just Teamer. Preordains to help find your cards, Atamio's Safekeeping to keep your combo alive. And the red is for Writhing Chrysalis, obviously just a nice card to keep you alive, or even in the right situation, go on a mid-range attack plan. Sideboard is nothing crazy with some Blue Blasts, Hydroblasts, Breath Weapon, a Negate, Pyroblast, and Weather the Storm. This type of deck is very new, so I'm sure this is not going to be the final iteration of the deck, but it was good enough to get Sestari all the way to 13th place. Always sweet to see a brand new deck do so well at a tournament like this. I'm sure we'll see more of this combo in the future. 12th place, we have our second White Weenie player, similarly running 3 Leonardo, 2 Spider-Man, and a Steadfast Unicorn. Nothing else too out of place here. 10th place, Elves, has some very interesting sideboard choices with Rooftop Percher, a 5-mana 3/3 with flying, and when it enters, it exiles up to 2 target cards from graveyards and you gain 3 life with Changeling. So this is technically an elf, which is a great upside obviously, but also just a way to have both a graveyard hate and life gain card in the same sideboard slot. Definitely an interesting include. And in addition to the, of course, 4 Masked Vandals in the main deck, we're also playing 2 Voracious Varmint, probably the next best card to destroy artifacts, and I would assume a choice specifically geared towards fighting the Grixis Affinity threat that was so prevalent this weekend. Finally, we get to 9th place here, playing Grixis Affinity, 4 Ultra Monitor, just a 1-of Surveillance Cam. Similarly to the Gixian Infiltrator I talked about before, that we only have 1 pilot with, this is the only deck playing Hunter's Blowgun, another card that rose in popularity for a little while. Still a very good card to include in your Grixis Affinity deck, but most people seem to have shifted back to all Toxin Analysis. But Kasu made 9th place here with 1 Toxin, 1 Hunter's Blowgun, so who's in the right? Hard to tell. Tons of sweet cards in those top 64 deck lists, but we are moving on to the top 8. And these are the top 8 competitors going for the win of Paupergeddon Spring Edition 2026. Carlo Pietropoli on Ruby Storm versus James Trefaz on Gardens or Food Pestilence. Lorenzo Tartarini on Grixis Affinity in the mirror match against Lou Anton Hauser, also on Affinity. We have Jedrick Schmid on Azorius Familiars versus Andrea Feltrine on Elves. And then Eugene Yeloyan on John Wildfire versus Lorenzo Pucci on Demir Terror. 7 different decks in the top 8 is already a fantastic thing to see, and the Grixis Affinity players playing against each other means that the top 4 and onward will all be different decks. If you watch the coverage, the first match we were able to watch was this Ruby Storm versus Pestilence Gardens. James Trefaz, also known as True Name Nemesis on MTGO, you may know them as that, playing this deck list that I know they've been working on for a very long time, running a playset of Cast Down. A lot of these lists are running about 6 removal spells, usually 4 Cast Down, and then the last 2 cards could be Go for the Throat, Tragic Slip, I've seen a Candy Grapple. Here we're on Go for the Throat and Snuff Out as those extra 2 single target removal spells. In addition to, of course, 3 Pestilence and 2 Tithing Blades. A 1-of Heritage Reclamation. This is a card that I think has been a little undervalued, a little underplayed in the format thus far. It's showed up as a sideboard card sometimes, and that's a great spot for it. But I love to see it here in the main deck because its utility is just enormous. If you go up against an Affinity opponent, or even something like Bogles, the artifact or enchantment removal is going to be fantastic. Almost every deck either plays artifacts, enchantments, or cares about the graveyard, so it's almost always going to have a use, and at worst case, it cycles for 2. Love to see it here. We have 10 foods in the deck with 2 Heaped Harvest, 4 Lembas, 4 Nutrient Block, and then 3 Cauldron Familiars to eat up those food. Campfires, Spell Bombs, Wellsprings as various artifacts, of course Colony Garden, Rot Farm, Bajuka Bog for various effects, and some Troll of Khazad-dûm. Sideboard looks relatively standard with some Graveyard Hate, Fogs, Troublemaker Oofs, Weather the Storm, Drown Sorrows, but also another Snuff Out and Tragic Slip for additional creature hate. Going to be playing against Carlo Pietropoli on Ruby Storm, also known as Data Pusher online, so this is a bit of an MTGO grinder matchup. And this Ruby Storm list looks extremely streamlined. Some of the other lists we saw were featuring some other unique cards. This one, just about all 2s and 4s of your cards except for 3 First Day of Class, 5 Mountains. Sideboard, some of those same Learn cards that we've seen before, Weather the Storm, Gruul Turf, Red Blast, and a Flaring Pain as well. Then for the Grixis Affinity Mirror match, we have Lorenzo Tartarini playing this list right here, playing only 2 of the new Utrom Monitor. So many lists we saw were playing a full 4 of them, and interestingly playing 3 Fanatical Offering, 3 Reckoner's Bargain, choosing 2 Chromatic Stars to add to the deck list. Star is definitely a card we've seen in Grixis Affinity before, but with so many new cards printed that have improved this deck over the last couple years, definitely has just seemed like a card that's been pushed out and not had a spot for it. But showing up again here is super sweet. Also a 1-of Swamp, which can be extremely important against the Wildfire opponents trying to blow up your lands, or against Initiative, which is showing up not just in Gruul monsters, but also, of course, so many Elves lists now. Sideboard, lots of Blasts, a Negate, an Envelop, 2 Extract a Confession, another Spell Bomb, even a Gorilla Shaman for the Mirror, which is going to be be really helpful here, and an Arms of Hadar versus Lou Anton Hauser's deck list here, which doesn't seem to be featuring as many of those 1 and 2 ofs. 4 Utrom Monitor, 4 Reckoner's Bargain and 1 Fanatical Offering, 3 Blood Fountains, no Swamp to be found. Other than that, just classic staples for the deck: Krark Clan Shaman, Mirror Enforcer, Ichor Wellspring, Nile Spellbomb, Galvanic Blast, Thoughtcast. Sideboard, similarly, a bunch of blasts: Extract Confession, Breath Weapon, Unexpected Fangs, but also the only Grixis Affinity deck list in top 64 to play Metallic Rebuke as its counterspell choice in the sideboard. So many other lists are running Negates and Envelops. Here, choosing the catch-all of Rebuke, but of course, it falls off a little bit into the late game, as your opponent can pay the 3 pretty easily. Moving on, we have Andrea Feltrine on Elves, running a deck list with only 15 different cards in it. A 1 Sagu Wildling, Gingerbread Cabin, and Elvish Mystic. Other than that, playsets of everything and 13 Forests. Sideboard, Fairy Macabres, Monstrous Emergence, Vitu-Ghazi, and Spectre are all staples that we're expecting in Elves at this point. But Viridian Longbow, my friend David is going to be exuberant about that, because it's some tech that doesn't see a lot of play in Elves anymore, but can be really powerful if you put it on any creature, and then you can untap that creature with Korean Ranger, can ping down any number of opposing creatures, great in the mirror match. Also a brand new card, Primordial Pachyderm, the only Elves player in the top 64 playing this one. 4/4 for 4 with Reach and Trample, and it's another creature that when it enters, it gains you a couple life. Elves here are going to be playing against Jedrick Schmid on Blue-White Familiars. Jedrick actually just started a new podcast with Skura, one of the commentators for Paupergeddon. They put up their first episode last week, and it was absolutely fantastic. He's a great player and also writes a lot of content for Familiars and other decks, so make sure to check him out. But here, running what he believes to be the best version of Familiars, the Meeting of Minds version. Hard to beat, a free draw 2. Of course, there's plenty of ways to play Familiars. This is his preferred. Otherwise, everything in the main deck looks pretty standard. Archaeomancer's Ghostly, 1 of Ghostly Flicker and 3 Ephemerates. That number is often a little bit more even. 3 Muldrifters, 2 Murmuring Mystics, 3 Seagate Oracles, 2 Prohibits, and a Remove Soul. Lorien Revealed, Preordain, Snap, and even a 1 of Negate in the main deck. Sideboard, we have Hydroblast, Last Breath, Negate, Remove Soul, another deck playing Stonehorn Dignitary in the side, a couple Thraben Charms, and Loyal Sentry, which is a fantastic include to see here. Not even just a meme, because it seems pretty powerful. Familiars usually has a tough matchup against Mono Blue Terror. This is a way to help deal with that. Loyal Sentry is a white mana for a 1/1. Whenever this creature blocks, destroy it and the creature it is blocking. Meaning this is a 1/1 that can trade for a Terror easily, but it also is a trigger that goes on the stack, so if you want to ephemerate that Loyal Sentry, you can actually keep it around while still blowing up your opponent's attacker. Really sweet to see here that even in the top 8, we can have some sweet innovation. Finally, for our last match, we have Lorenzo Pucci on Dimir Terror, running probably the lowest number of cast downs I've seen in a Dimir Terror list. Just 1 copy with 4 snuff outs. Most lists I'm seeing 3 cast down, 3 snuff out, or 4 snuff out, something like that. Just 5 removal spells here. Of course, we have 4 counter spells, 2 Spell Pierce, and we're also running a main deck Murmuring Mystic here. Sideboard, we have a 1 of Agony Warp. Agony Warp, of course, can be a hedge against Guardian of the Guild Pact, against Coggates. Now, I would even say it can be a hedge against Leonardo, as cast down doesn't kill that, although in this list, only 1 cast down isn't going to be too big of a deal against that. And of course, Agony Warp can just be strong against things like Red Rally that feature enough creatures that you can shrink 1 and kill another. In the sideboard, we also have a Null, 2 Arms of Hadar, Blue Blasts, Extract Confession, Hydroblast, another Mystic, some Spell Bombs, and Steel Sabotage. Definitely a solid Dimir Terror list. And like I said, 6 of 6 players playing Dimir Terror made day 2 and made the top 64. Here we're seeing 1 of them even make the top 8. This deck truly must be a force to be reckoned with. And our final top 8 player, Eugene Yeloyan on Jund Wildfire. 1 Wildfire did make it here, and I think we're seeing a relatively stock list here. 1 Blood Fountain, 1 Pulsa Marasa, and 1 Wildling. Definitely cards that you sometimes see in fewer or greater number here. 3 Spellbomb, 3 Krark Clan Shamans in the main deck, 2 Toxin Analysis, and just a ton of card draw here with a makeshift munitions. Sideboard, some Troublemaker Oofs, Pyroblast, Weather the Storm, Breath Weapon, Duress, and Spellbomb. After these 4 matches took place, we had Pietrapoli on Ruby Storm winning it over Golgari Pestilence. Any sort of Gardens deck is generally going to have trouble with a spell-based combo deck, and that's what we see here. One of the Grixis Affinity players obviously made it out. That is Tartarini. Andre Feltrine took it Elves versus Azorius Familiars, and then Lorenzo Pucci, Dimir Terror over Jund Wildfire. Then after those matchups, we get to our finals, which is Lorenzo Tartarini on Grixis Affinity taking it over Ruby Storm, and Andrea Feltrin on Elves taking it over Dimir Terror. Grixis Affinity and Elves is such a legacy matchup to have here. Two decks that have been around since the beginning of the format, obviously through lots of evolutions, but still maintaining the same core of the deck that they always have. And as we talked about earlier, Elves actually has a pretty favored matchup here, unless Grixis Affinity can land its Krark Clan Shaman and absolutely wipe the board and take over from there. Elves, of course, though, has Masked Vandals that can be absolutely devastating to the Grixis Affinity pilot if they lose their lands early. If you did not watch this match, I highly encourage you to go do so. But without further delay, the player who was the Paupergeddon Spring Edition 2026 champion was Andrea Feltrin with Elves. In a quick 2-0 sweep, Andrea was able to exile several of Lorenzo's lands with Vandals in both games, maintain the initiative for several turns, until eventually coming out on top. It's incredible to see a deck like Elves make it all the way to first place in a tournament this large, when 12% of the metagame was playing Mono Red Madness, a deck that usually just dominates Elves. Andrea Feltrin did say in an interview after the match that maybe a little bit of a secret to his success was that he played against Mono Red Madness 0 times over the weekend, which is such a bummer. He had to waste sideboard slots for all of those burn matchups that he never had to play against. Congratulations, of course, to Andrea Feltrin. This is a fantastic win from a great player. Thanks so much to the Paupergeddon team for putting on such a fantastic event. Of course, to the coverage team and everyone else who made the tournament possible. It's so great to have tournaments like this for a format that was once so small, but means so much to such a great number of us. You couldn't ask for a better format or a better showing of how many great, fantastic different decks we have, with so many different game plans. And each of the last 3 Paupergeddons, I think, shows something so incredible. In fall of 2025, we had Red Madness as the most prevalent deck of the format, winning the whole tournament, showing obviously that a deck with a ton of great players can do super well. Mono Red Madness is also a deck coming off of the back of the Kuldotha ban about 8 months prior to that event, showing that a ban might kill a specific variation of a deck, but it also just opens up a lot of possibilities for people to brew other decks in its place. Paupergeddon Summer last year, we had an absolute underdog of Cawgates with only 5 pilots, one of which made it to first place despite Jund Wildfire, a deck that preys upon Cawgates often, being such a prevalent threat, showing that with enough skill, determination, and maybe a little bit of luck, even a more fringe deck can win a giant tournament like this. And then of course this tournament, Elves being such a prominent player of course, but with a severe disadvantage against the most prevalent deck. With the right sideboarding choices, as we saw with Walker 735 and Lignify, you can absolutely beat up on the matches that are meant to target you if you bring the right tech, or you can even just get lucky and not play against them at all, and that can be a huge service to you as well. I just love being able to watch every single Paupergeddon. I would love to go to a Paupergeddon eventually in the future, if that's a possibility, and I'm just very grateful for everybody who has been a part of this, and even just to the players for putting on a great show, showcasing their skill and their talent for the enjoyment of all of us. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time.